Hi everyone, welcome to the SPREE seminar. Today we have Sharon Young presenting work from her PhD, which she's recently submitted and it's currently under examination. So there's quite a lot of work out there looking at the impact of PV, integrating PV into power systems, but Sharon's work is a bit different because she uses real data sets and she looks at how PV and storage might be operated under real tariffs, so to get a better sense of the impact of distributed PV and storage. So welcome Sharon, and so Sharon was supervised by myself and Ian McGill, and so it's great to have Sharon here today, and over to you.
All right. So, thank you all for coming and for listening to me, which I only have 43 slides, so we should be fine. All right, before I actually begin, I actually want to take just a very quick time to appreciate the late Professor Stuart Wenham. It was because of him that I started in the first ever class of the PV degree, and when I crashed out, Stuart gave me the chance to come back again, finish the degree, which set me up to do this PhD. So I just wanted to give him honour because he made a difference in my life, and without him, you wouldn't be listening to me. So my thesis kind of started with the big fat question, when we're looking particularly at PV and definitely at storage, what on earth is going to happen next? And so the question starts to be, how much do households add up? If so much of our PV is coming from households, how much difference do the households make? What happens if all of these homes start to get battery storage? And how do these effects add up and affect the rest of the industry? This is a wonderful, familiar graph, just seeing that wonderful pickup and acceleration of PV across Australia. And it was, when this was half the size, that was about when I started my PhD. And just a couple of houses had, PV, and then there were a few more, and then they took over we're up to about 2 million at the moment. And that's when I actually submitted my PhD. So in terms of trying to work out what was happening next with PV, it's already happening, which is why predicting the future is extremely difficult. But if we actually build some lovely big fat models, we can have a go. What you need for models is data and more data. I've been working with the Smart Grid, Smart City household load data, been working with the Ausgrid solar homes data, so load data for several thousand homes, PV data for a couple of hundred homes, been looking at national electricity market load data, price data, and also comparing things with the net system load profile data. The one beautiful thing about all of these lovely data sets is that they are concurrent. Now, the fun thing with this is when you do modelling with simulated data, it's very hard to pick up things like the extremes in demand and things like that. So peak demand days, the demand is so wildly out of proportion to the normal days that it's unlikely to come up in simulation. The other thing with simulated data is that you can't necessarily get that relationship between temperature and household generation and household consumption data and how that all stacks up. But by having the concurrent data, you get a beautiful ability to test those interactions. Looking at the household data, one of the things that I did, I had several thousand households loads worth of data, but it's not necessarily guaranteed to be representative. Also had the net served load profile data, NSLP data, and that is all of the accumulation meter data for a distribution area. And so that also includes a little bit of commercial data as well. So neither of those are perfect data sets, but when comparing one against the other, when they're scaled to the appropriate level, there's actually an extremely high correlation. 0.96 is pretty nice. So that means that I was able to use the household load data scaled up to test effects at a state level. So all models are wrong because I'm using this kind of assumptions. There's data that's not quite perfect, but it's quite useful. So if we look first at just how much household actions start to add up, one of the ways to look at it is what is the household contribution to demand at any given time. And in New South Wales, it varies a little bit from state to state, but it's roughly in the same ballpark. In New South Wales, we're looking at about 27-28% is the average contribution. But as you can see from the graph, it does kind of vary a lot, and you are anywhere between about 13.5% and not quite 49%. And particularly at these times of summer peak demand and also winter peak demand, we see this enormous contribution to the state demand coming from the households. It's more than 45%. And so, in other words, what households do really does matter, which is terribly useful because that means I actually had a thesis to go in. So when we actually start to look at that household demand versus the state demand, when we're looking at it across the year, so this is 17,520 half hours across 1 year, comparing that cumulative household data against that state level national electricity data, we do see a couple of interesting things. There is a seasonal correlation in that demand escalation. When the households use more in winter, what we're actually seeing is that this is contributing to more energy consumption in winter overall. What we're also seeing is a correlation between that peak demand at a state level and also that household demand. Now, the household peak is not absolutely coincident with the residential peak. They're out by a couple of hours, but there's a fairly strong connection. And in particular, when you're seeing that state demand, the peak demand lift from about 10 gigawatts to about 14 gigawatts, about 3 gigawatts of that is coming from that household load going up from about 3 gigawatts to about 6. So again, this highlights what households do matter, and so therefore what we look at in terms of what those households do is actually incredibly important. One of the interesting things is that huge uplift in household demand seen in summertime, going from normally 3 gigawatts to about 6, isn't actually replicated in wintertime. In winter, what you actually see is that a peak day is not too much different from a normal day. It's just in this New South Wales, when it's cold, we just turn the thermostat up. It's not actually a strong, there's not a lot of difference between that peak day and that not peak day. The other thing to just notice is when we look at the normal contribution of household demand to the state demand versus on a peak day, that household contribution to peak demand is much, much more significant. So all in all, what households do matters. So if these households actually start to get storage, how the behaviour of the storage changes is going to be important as well. So one of the first things that we need to do is actually start to model how batteries can behave in different circumstances. So one of the things that we want to look at is how we would size battery systems, or also size PV systems, what kind of tariff types we would be operating with, what the limitations are on the battery operation. So the cycle efficiency, the maximum charge rate, the maximum discharge rate, things like that all need to be sort of factored in. And then you need to work out the relationship with the PV and load data and how that affects the battery state of charge over time. Most of my modelling has been a snapshot over a single year, so I haven't factored in battery degradation over the course of that year, and most of my work has focused particularly on how tariffs change battery behaviour, how existing tariffs change that behaviour. So I've also not focused a lot on optimising battery use according to battery chemistry or things like that. That's not been a focus of my work. It's been all about how price signals dictate battery behaviour, because that's one of the real world options of how batteries are likely to be operated. And so most of what I've done is been building through a mathematical model built in MATLAB. A lot of that's been done using different forms of logic decision making, so using the time-based tariff, so things like a time of use tariff. You're choosing whether or not to run the battery during a peak period or an off-peak period or on a shoulder period. So that's our sort of first decision, and then following that you're starting to look at whether the load minus PV is negative or positive. So does the PV already supply your load, or do you need to draw from the battery, or is there enough charge in the battery to draw from, and just sort of stepping through that. With a flat tariff, it's much more simple decision making. You're not taking into account any time or anything like that. You are just considering is there enough supply from the PV to meet the demand, or is there a need to draw from the battery or draw from the grid? Within my modelling, I was working mostly with a subset of about sort of 2,200 houses, and they had quite a large range of average daily consumption and total annual consumption. There is somebody right out on the far outlier. There is a house that actually managed to use 100 kilowatt hours a day on average. I don't actually know how you do that, but there are some households that do that. But the median value was around 4,800 or so. And so houses that were less than one standard deviation under the median were given a smaller system. Houses that were more than a standard deviation over the median size were given a large system, and everyone else was given a medium-sized one. So because you can reasonably expect that a house that has a high energy consumption is going to try to get a bigger system. A house that has a small energy consumption should get a smaller system, unless you've got really, really pushy sales guys, which does happen. So looking at the uptake of PV and things, PV and storage starts to be a question of, is it economically viable? PV's definitely has got there, but how much further do we have to go before we actually start to see storage being economically viable? Because that's when we're going to just see that absolute takeoff. The bill savings do depend a bit on the tariff. One of the interesting things is that the proposed demand tariff that's being suggested as a proposed network tariff doesn't actually deliver quite the same savings for households as the other tariffs do, but the spread is fairly consistent anyway. But the savings that you do realise do depend partially on your setup and partially on how much energy you consume. Households that don't actually use a lot of energy are just not going to soak up that much PV. You're going to have quite a large amount of export, which is actually one of the things that we see up here. The smaller the home you have, the more of your generation you're going to export. The bigger the home you have, the more of that PV generation you are just going to soak up regardless of your battery. But as soon as you throw a battery on there, your exported generation absolutely plummets. The other thing to note with this is that the more that you use your battery, so the wider your operational hours, the bigger your savings get. And the more that actually reduces your exports. So the more that you the more that you export, just a small amount of storage just makes a small, big difference. And in the case of the flat tariff and the time of use shoulder tariff, these are two operational strategies that use the batteries over a wide range of wide timescale, and so the battery is actually charged and discharged more heavily, whereas in the case of the time of use and the demand tariff, the batteries are not used as much, and so again more PP is generated, exported. That's just the same thing. All of these things do sort of add up and affect your payback times. One of the interesting things is this little contrast that if you just got a PV system, the fastest way to pay back your PV system is to have a smaller PV system. That's actually taking into account the fact that the cost per kilowatt installed is higher for smaller systems than it is for larger systems. But the thing is that as soon as you whack storage on there, the bigger the PV you have, the more of that energy you can store, and the better off you are. So optimizing the setup for your household actually does make a considerable difference. One of the quite entertaining things there is if you had a low energy consumption household that was pushed into buying a large PV system and a large battery system, it would take about 25 years to pay off. Whereas if you look at a household getting with a large amount of energy consumption and a small battery system but a large PV system, that actually pays off already in about 7.5 years. And so that's actually something very interesting to keep an eye on. These payback times have been quite an interesting area to explore. If we look at something like a 7-year payback time, which is considered reasonable but in a large amount of the industry, the reality is small households, it's going to be a long time before you get there. The interesting thing is that with these larger households, if we don't go crazy on the battery size, for about 20% of the larger households, it's already economically viable to install PV and a small battery and make a whacking great dent in your bills, and it will pay for itself in less than 7 years. But the other thing that's particularly worth noting is that for medium households, so the average user, it's only about 2 or 3 years away before these guys start to become economically viable, as in paying for themselves in about 7 years. Again, you can't go too crazy with a battery size for this to work, but it's possible. So this means that we actually need to start looking at what the effects are on the rest of the industry, because the batteries are absolutely coming. So we'll start with, first of all, what happens to the networks. And one of the things with the networks is because a large proportion of the revenue at the moment is recovered through volumetric tariffs, if they don't get as much, if they don't have as much volume passing through the poles and the wires, they don't get as much revenue. And the more as soon as you add storage on there, you basically double the amount of revenue reduction that the networks see per household. On the other hand, one of the main areas of network expenditure has been expanding and reinforcing the network in order to respond to peak demand. One of the nice things is that if we install both PV and batteries, that peak demand starts to drop, almost without actually really trying too hard. It doesn't make an enormous difference between the tariffs, which tariff you use. It will still it'll still cause a drop in that peak demand, and when you start to scale it up to a state level, that drop in peak demand of a couple of percent starts to add up to millions and millions of dollars in deferred or avoided network expenditure. And this is the fun thing. All of these effects from the homes start to stack up, and the effects all kind of merge together into one big thing. And again, I want to reinforce this is this fun connection that's kind of starts with just sort of individual homes and how an individual home is operated. And as you get more and more homes operated on the same pattern, which is not unreasonable at the moment, probably most of New South Wales, about 80% of households are still on accumulation meters, so they're still probably on flat rate tariff, similar in Queensland. So having households operating on a similar tariff means that you are probably going to see households with a similar operating strategy. And so these are all for the same house, all on the same day, all with pretty much the same PV system, all with the same battery characteristics. It's just changing how that battery operates according to the tariff. Critical line to watch there is basically the state of charge, and also a little bit on the battery exports, because that state of charge has a lot of effect on what those exports are. And so this is the same house across 1 year on different tariffs, and what you see is that battery state of charge fluctuates considerably. Mostly on the flat tariff, you are draining it, then you're filling it, and very often you're sort of somewhere between sort of 0 and 1 in terms of state of charge. On the time of use tariffs and on the demand tariffs, you're operating within a much more reduced time period, because you really want to make sure you've got that charge in your battery when energy is most expensive. So because of that, the battery stays fuller more often. You see that with the time of use tariff. Time of use shoulder tariff, it's operating the battery not just at the time of use peak time, but also during the time of use shoulder periods. So operating from about 7 a.m. to about 10 p.m. instead of 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. And you see that reflected in the state of charge. Sometimes the battery is used all the way. And the critical thing is what this does to the exports. If you have no storage, you're always going to export a fair bit. On the flat tariff, you don't export nearly as much as you could otherwise. On the time of use and the demand tariff, you are always going to export more than you would on any other tariff. And this sort of starts to add up at a local level and at a system level. This is where you start to see things like the reverse flows happening at a local level. And what we actually see on this graph is particularly a plot of how the exports would add up at a local substation level across 1 day. And what you actually see, obviously with no storage, you've got your peak exports. With the demand tariff, the time of use tariff, because they do have that restricted hours, the battery fills up sooner, and so more of that generation gets exported. Again, you're stepping down with that shoulder tariff, you're using the battery a bit more, and then on the flat tariff, you're maximising the use of your battery as much as possible, so while you still export some power, this is a summer day, you don't export nearly as much as you could otherwise. And this is where those system level effects start to continue to add up. And it's not just at a local level, it adds up to a state level. And I would like to point out that the state level impacts are absolutely dominated by how much PV you've got installed. That really makes the most difference to your overall profile. But after you've taken that into account, how you operate the battery has very different effects on what your actual total load profile. So this is a weekday, and one of the fun things also with reduced hours of operation is if the battery still has charge in it by the end of your operating hours, and then it just swaps back to the grid because it's now time for cheaper electricity. You actually also see this fun little uptick, and so your peak demand may move from 6 p.m. or at a state level 3 or 4 p.m. until 8:01, where you just get this nasty uptick going on, or in the case of a shoulder tariff, it could be 10 p.m. But yeah, how you use those batteries, that simple residential tariff thing really starts to add up. And it's very fun. So one of the other things that I looked at was sort of, if you look at this at a wholesale level, what does it do at a wholesale market level, and how much does that actually change the revenue at a wholesale market level? And I would like to point out, trying to work out the price at a given half hour in the NEM for a given demand value is not very easy. This is actually the same week in January, about 2 or 3 years apart, and yeah, the year that has the greatest amount of demand is not the year with the highest price, and gets terribly confusing. And so I've ended up having to merge price and demand levels for a couple of different years to get an approximation. But when you sort of look at this and you try and work out how household distributed energy is going to affect wholesale market revenue, it's PV that absolutely dominates. And so in this particular example, this is a flat tariff scenario, and this is the same amount of PV installed, about 6 gigawatts, I think. And it, while the battery shifts the demand around quite a lot, it doesn't actually change the revenue nearly as much as the PV changes the revenue, because the PV is the one that's critically reducing the total volume of energy traded. The batteries are just moving around when it's traded. One of the limitations of this is that I don't actually have the means in this model to calculate how ramping costs might be incurred and what those may add up to. So if, as we're seeing this massive upswing in the evening, we have to dispatch gas generators instead of coal generators, which have a higher marginal cost, that may actually affect the outcomes of this, and therefore the smoother the profile, we may find that that actually delivers a cheaper outcome. But I haven't had the modelling to do that. I'm working on it now. As previously said, the PV does dominate the revenue, but the tariff in particular actually dictates the details of this. And one of the things that is important to note about this is because these tariffs do, because the tariffs do dictate when generation is exported and when it's used at home, what we actually see is whether or not we've got more low price events under one tariff than under another one. And what we actually see is the flat tariff has the least amount of low price events as compared to a PV only scenario. And again, these times where the tariffs dictate a higher level of exports, what we actually see is that the more the tariffs encourage exports, the more low price events that we actually see. And conversely, what we also see is at times of higher demand, those get pulled down more by the flatter tariffs, but not by much. So one of the things is, having spent all this time looking at how tariffs shape battery behaviour and how these effects add up, one of the interesting questions is, can you actually get good tariffs that deliver good outcomes? And at the moment, as a consequence of the Power of Choice review, networks are being required to deliver cost-reflective tariffs to consumers for future development to deliver good price signals and change demand. And ideally, this is supposed to sort of flatten out peak demand. But but as we get more and more PV coming in, we may need to smooth by lifting minimum demand. One of the fun things about cost-reflective tariffs is that they are really, really hard to balance. You actually have, even within the very concept, you have a couple of key requirements that are kind of in conflict with each other. Because on the one hand, you need to provide some level of revenue certainty for the service providers. Because if we don't provide that, we keep reducing the network revenue on a cost per unit basis, that volumetric tariff, they've got to put the prices up and up and up. So trying to avoid that is important. But if we make it really certain for the networks by putting in high fixed charges or something like that, we really start to kill off the consumer ability to respond to any given price signal. So this is tricky enough. And then there's the matter of actually trying to craft a tariff that's actually properly cost reflective, that consumers can actually understand. And one of the fun things is when you are doing tariff research and energy research, of course you understand tariffs, how they work, what the components are, and what the pricing structure is. You try to go to the average consumer and they go, well, if I use more, it'll cost more. And you cannot guarantee that they will understand a whole lot more than this. And it's backed up by some work by CSIRO on cost-reflective tariffs. Consumers struggle with the more complex ones. And even then, when you're starting to look at cost-reflective tariffs, if you don't want to go down that line, one of the other questions is which costs you want to reflect. So consumers clearly understand a flat rate tariff, the more I use, the more I pay. Where you can potentially ask consumers to pay according to their maximum demand. And that's actually, it's not a perfect reflection, but it's not a bad start. But as we start to charge consumers according to their contribution to peak demand, it's not a fantastic correlation. And so reflecting prices is actually something that's really quite complex. So I kind of gave up on trying to design the perfect cost-reflective tariff. I did look at that for a while. And I started to look at just tariffs to deliver a smoother load profile given batteries. Because the one nice thing about batteries that is fantastic is they will do whatever you tell them to. And so whatever they are programmed to do, presumably reduce costs, they'll do it. And so if we can actually create a tariff that reduces costs for consumers and smooths out the overall load profile, that's a nice idea. So I had a little starting point of looking at our time of use tariff, and the tariff as it stands is constructed in a way that reasonably well reflects wholesale market demand. And you do pay a higher price at times of higher demand, so it's reflecting that cost moderately well. But as we get more and more PV, what we may see is that time of use tariff does not actually reflect the shape of demand as it will become. But we can actually potentially reform that with a time-shifted time of use tariff that could use the batteries better and create that overall smooth profile. So if we just take the time of use tariff and shift it by a few hours so that it better lines up with where the new peak in demand will be and where the new trough in demand will be, we really change the battery usage, and some of the issues that are associated with that limited operation period start to go away, and we do see a much greater use of the battery even over the same time periods than we otherwise would. One of the other things is that both in the winter peak, which is at the top, and in the summer peak at the bottom, We do actually see that under the alternative tariffs, where we've got a time-shifted time of use tariff, taking into account current demand, or demand with PV, we do actually see that raising of the belly of the duck, for those of you familiar with the duck curve, and we also see a dropping in peak demand. And this also works in summertime, which is fantastic. So there are ways to use battery tariffs to deliver peak demand, to deliver smoother demand overall, but we do need to make a few interesting adjustments along the way. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you so much. Young.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. This was really interesting. I have two questions. One's more of a comment, the other one's a question. So you said that at the beginning, but you said you didn't factor in the battery lifetime in your models. I just want to comment out that actually it would be very interesting, because the way you use a battery, you have a better cyclability and a better lifetime of your battery if you use the state of charge between like 30 and 70%, for example, than when you use the extremes or completely cut them out. So you're going to impact your return on investment, where if you use the battery one way or another, you have to change it in 5 years or in 10 years, right? Like you have to buy a whole new system. I just want to point that out. I think it would be interesting to like factor that in. The question I had was have you looked at using, like, let's say you said that you have a large PV system with a little bit of battery is better than not having battery at all. But if you have a small PV system and the same battery, it would be less cost efficient to use it that way, right? What about if you have no solar, just batteries, and you take electricity, you charge a battery with grid electricity when it's cheap, and then you use it when it's expensive?
Yeah, I did think about going into that. I didn't actually end up with enough time to do it. Given that you do have a 30-cent price differential between peak and off-peak, it's plausible. As again, I haven't actually run the numbers. I did run out of time because I needed to finish this thing before the technology just completely superseded me. Yeah, it's possible, but given that we're now up to about 1 in 5 households with PV, I thought that was the more probable cause in the first place, or the more probable scenario in the first place, which is why I focused on that.
Another question, I'm sure that maybe
with the wholesale tariff that you put in, if with gentailers, wouldn't they have a possibility to kind of game the system with that kind of tariff?
Yeah, I mean, gentailers have the ability to game the system anyway. No, I think...
Is there a regulational kind of article you can put in there that will prevent that?
Yeah, so within the electricity, you've got the generators, the transmission, the distribution, the retailers. Transmission and distribution are regulated monopolies. It is technically the networks, the regulated monopolies, that set the tariff structure. However, retailers are not obligated to pass on the tariffs in their exact form, and very often don't do a perfect translation. Yeah, look, there's so much interesting complexity in the way that the wholesale market in and of itself operates. But I think for a gentailer that happened to own any coal generators, they'd actually probably be a little bit enthusiastic about households maximising their battery use, because that actually raises that minimum demand in the middle of the day. It means that they can keep the coal generators on without having to bid negative. And then the question is sort of just how that little peak is managed, because those peak demand events, you can have 20 half hours in a year be 10% of a generator's revenue, which is insane.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sharon. It was really, really fascinating. I had a question about, you mentioned a battery payback period with, I think it was with solar, about 7.5 years.
Yes.
That is incredible. I was wondering whether you had any sort of thoughts or whether you had a chance to look at the sort of trajectory of that payback period and whether that's a sort of fairly recent thing or whether that's how long it's been kind of affordable in that way.
Okay, so I'll just hop. So first thing is that 7.5 year payback is a specific setup for a specific group of households. These are the large energy usage households, and this is a large PV setup with a small battery setup. So, this is for a battery that would probably be all of about 5 kilowatt hours instead of your, Tesla Powerwall, which is 12 or something, or 12 or 15 or something. So you're not looking at this huge size battery, and so that's the first thing. Is just this is a specific setup, and I did have a look at the potential trajectory. So on average, up until a couple of years ago, battery prices were going down across the industry at roughly 14% per annum. That was the learning rate for lithium-ion batteries, and so I did sort of start to track that across just basically the next 5 years. And again, it depends on your household consumption level and all of that. But if we're looking at this optimum payback setup, which is the large PV and the small battery, then it starts to get quite nice fairly soon. But if you don't have that optimum setup, you don't hit those numbers.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Could you go back one slide again?
This one?
Yep. So if I understand this correctly, you're saying that, say for the large homes, if you have say at the bottom right corner, if you had only PV and no battery, you'd have a 4.7 year payback time.
Yes.
And then if you install a small battery system, is that now the combined payback time for your entire PV plus battery system is now 7.6 years?
Yes.
Okay. So does that mean? Well, I think that means that.
So that is on the assumption that the household did actually install a battery-ready inverter prior to this, because if they start with a non-battery-ready inverter, it does push the payback time up.
So then, my question or comment is that if the consumer is making a decision, let's say they've decided they definitely want a PV system, so they're at 4.71 years, and now they're making a decision: should I install a battery? That the payback time on the battery purchase, I think, would be well more than the 7 years. Is that a correct?
This is for the system as a whole.
Yeah. So in terms of
and keep in mind, it's a small battery. It's not a big one. So you're not paying $12,000 for this. You're paying $4,000.
right, but I think that payback period on the battery purchase is quite long. I think that's my understanding.
Yeah.
If you isolated it from the PV system, so if you consider that you've already bought that and you're going to get a payback already, and then you're now deciding, should I add a battery system or not? What's the relative cost is a certain amount, and the relative benefit, and how long that payback would be.
Yeah, I didn't separate the payback time of the battery from the PV, so it's either you buy a PV system or you buy a PV and battery system. I mean, Johan there talked about testing the payback just using price arbitrage between peak and off-peak. And again, that's something that I didn't have a lot of time to explore. If you are just adding a battery on top, like that's a scenario that I didn't explore. It's just an assumption that it would be more likely for households to be installing PV and storage at the moment, and as prices of storage come down, then they'll be added on.
Last question. Okay, so let's thanks Sharon again for great seminar.